Creating these classes requires equipment and services that cost money. If you appreciate this education, please think about going to elithecomputerguy.com and offering a one-time or monthly recurring donation. Welcome back. As you know, I am Eli the Computer Guy. In today's class, we're going to be talking about joins, or more specifically, inner joins in regards to MySQL databases. So when we're talking about joins, what we're talking about doing is actually taking two different tables within your MySQL database and connecting them and being able to deal with them as if they were one single table. So why this is important is, remember, MySQL is a relational database. So what this means is you have numerous different tables within your database, and each one of these tables is supposed to have a specific type of information to make it easier to deal with from a logical standpoint. So you may have a parts table, and you may have a vendors table, and you may have an orders table, and you may have a customers table, right? So you have a lot of different tables. Those tables are specific to one specific type of data that you're trying to bring in. And then what joins allow you to do is joins allow you to connect two different tables together and then be able to run SQL statements off of those two tables as if they were one single table. So what I'm going to be showing you today is we're going to be using an example using something called inner join, and we are going to take the parts table. So the parts table has a parts ID, it has a parts name, it has a parts price, and then it has a connection. It has a vendor's ID, right? So instead of actually putting all the information for the vendors within the parts table, you're going to have a vendor's ID, and then you're going to have a vendor's table, and that vendor's table is going to have a vendor's ID, and it's going to have a vendor's name, and it's going to have a vendor's address, and it can have a whole bunch of other things there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to join the two tables together, and then you can run a select statement off of those two tables as if they were one single table. So basically you can know that cogs come from Sue's Cogs Company in California, right? And so basically you're combining those two tables so that you can then run statements off of them as if they were one single table. And so this is one of the things that makes MySQL very valuable and very functional. And this is how you start bringing those different tables together. That's one of the issues a lot of new people have when they come to MySQL, and you see the different tables, right? You get the concept. You get the concept of, okay, a users table and an invoice table and a parts table and a vendors table. But then the question is well, but then how do you connect those tables together in order to make something that's actually useful? And one of the ways that you're able to do that is you're able to do that with these joins. So again, like with let's say with an invoice, right? So with an invoice table, you could join, and so you could reference a customer ID instead of having all the customer information within that invoice table. You could reference simply a customer ID, and then you could reference simply parts IDs or things like that. And that way your one invoice table can remain relatively small. It doesn't actually have to have a lot of information in it itself, because it's referencing these other tables, and then you're able to do joins then to make when you're looking at views or whatever, basically you're able to join these multiple tables into one single table in order to be able to interact with. So as I've said many times in this series, warning, Will Robinson, warning. So when we start talking about joins, there are actually numerous different types of joins. There's the inner join that we're going to be talking about today. There's right joins, there's left joins, right? There are numerous different types of joins, and these different joins give you different results. One of the problems you run into, especially with new people though, is you start talking about all these different types of joins, and then people get confused and frustrated, and then they go off and be florists, right? So I'm just going to be explaining to you an inner join today, and then in a future class we may talk about the different types of joins, or once you understand inner joins, you can go out and you can do some Google searching on your own to figure out the value of right joins and left joins and that type of thing. The important thing to understand about inner joins when we're doing an inner join is you're taking two tables, and basically you're joining those two tables off of columns that are both fully populated, right? So today when we're going to be doing the joins, we're going to have a parts table and we are going to have a vendors table. Within the parts table, there is going to be a vendor underscore ID column, right? And so for all of the parts, that will be populated. They will all have either be vendor ID 1, vendor ID 2, or vendor ID 3. And then over in the vendors table will also have a vendor underscore ID. column, and that obviously will be populated. And so basically, since these two tables have the vendor ID column populated, then you will be able to combine them with an inner join. If for some reason not all the fields in a column are fully populated, that's when you would want to do something such as a left join or a right join, but we may talk about those in the future, or again, do your research. So with this, the idea is the columns are fully populated. So every record in the column for vendor underscore ID, it has something in that field, and then that is able to correspond to the vendor ID over in the vendor field. So that's just something to keep in mind with what we're doing today. And just, when you're going ahead, do realize that there are other different types of joins out there. So if you're looking for a different way to be able to connect two tables, you might want to take a look at left joins or right joins. So now that you're starting to have an idea of what a join is, let's actually go over to the whiteboard so I can kind of scribble out what we're going to be doing before we go to the computer and I actually demonstrate it for you today. Okay, so here we are at the whiteboard. And so we're going to be dealing with two different tables today. The first table we will be dealing with is the parts table, right? So we have a parts table. Within the parts table, we are going to have a part ID. We are going to have a part name. We are going to have a part price. And then the important one is we are going to have a vendor ID, right? And so those are going to be the columns that we will be dealing with. Within those columns will be numerous different records. Then we are going to be having the vendors table. And in the vendors table, again, there will be multiple different columns. The first column will be the vendor ID, and then there will be the vendor name, and then there will be the vendor address, right? And then there will be different records here. And so basically what we're able to do is we're then able to populate the parts table. And so there will be a part ID 1, the name will be something like Cog, the price will be, let's say, $1. And then what we can do is we can say a vendor ID of 1. And then we can have a different part, so part ID 2, that is a nut. Price might be 2, and that has a vendor ID of 2. Part ID of 3, that's some kind of widget. Price of 3, a vendor ID of 3, right? And then you come over here to the vendors table, and in the vendors table, you have the vendor ID 1, 2, and 3, and then you'll have some company name under the name, Inc., LLC, Corp., and then you'll have the address. And essentially, what we'll be able to do is using the join. What we're going to do is we're going to join based off of this vendor ID number so that at the end of the day, as far as our SQL statements are going to be concerned, we're going to have one table. So we're going to have the parts table joined to the vendor table. And then here, it'll have the part ID, it'll have the part name, the part price, then it'll have the vendor ID, and then for the vendor, it'll have the vendor ID, then it'll have the name, and then it'll have the address. And so basically what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to do selects and all other kinds of MySQL statements because we're now going to be joining based off of that vendor ID. Now it is important to understand with the inner join, the type of join that I'm showing you today, that this vendor ID has to be populated on both sides. So 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, and so on. If for some reason there isn't a vendor ID in one of the records, you will have problems doing an inner join. But if you have a vendor ID in both columns, in both records, in both tables, then you'll be able to join, and then you'll be able to interact with these two tables as if they are one single table. So with that, let's go over to the computer so I can actually show you how this works within MySQL. Okay, so here we are back at my lab machine. Again, I've got Ubuntu Desktop 18.04. It is installed with an instance of VirtualBox that is on my MacBook Pro. I have used TaskCell to install the full LAMP stack. So we have Apache, MySQL, and PHP on this particular system. And we're going to go down to the lower left-hand corner. I'll click on Show Applications. And then up here, we're going to type in a terminal so that we can get to the terminal. And yay, we now have the terminal. Now, in order to log into MySQL, you should now have a user account. So in a previous class, I showed you how to create MySQL user accounts. If you do not have a user account yet for some reason, you can do sudo MySQL. This will log you into MySQL as the root user. You'll have all permissions, but we have a normal user account now. I've created a Bob user account, so we will log in that way. MySQL space -u, user account name, which is of course Bob, space -p. And then it's going to ask for the password, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now we are officially logged into MySQL. From here, what we're going to do is I'm going to do Control L, so that's going to clear the screen. And the first thing that we're going to do is show databases. So we want to see what databases we have in this MySQL server. So we have the databases, we have the four normal default databases, and then we have the class DB. So the class DB is the database that we're going to use. So then we use the use command to then go into class DB, semicolon, of course. And now we get some weird error I have to deal with later. But mainly our database has changed. That's the important thing. From here, we're then going to do show tables to show us what tables are in this database, semicolon. And so it'll show us what tables are in the class DB. So we have a parts table and we have a vendors table. Let me do Control L again. And then from here, what we're going to do is we're going to describe the table. So DESC. And then we're going to describe the parts table. So this will show us basically what the schema of the table looks like. We're going to do semicolon. And okay, so we've got the field, the data type, whether it's a primary key, any extra information. So we have a part ID field that is an integer, and that is the primary key, and it gets auto-incremented. So every time a new record is created, the part ID gets incremented by 1. Then we have a part name field that is text. Then we have a part price field that is float. So again, when you're dealing with numbers, an int is a whole number, 10, 11, 550. A float is a decimal point number, 10.50, 20.25, that type of thing. So since it's a part price, we're going to use a float. And then we have this vendor ID. So this is the vendor ID. This is what we're going to actually join with. And so basically the idea is that this part is offered or manufactured or whatever by this vendor ID. And that is going to be an int. Then what we're going to do is we're going to then describe the vendors table. So the other table is the vendors table, semicolon. We come in here, and so we see field, type, extra. So we have a vendor ID. So this is how we're going to be joining, is based off of this vendor ID. The vendor ID is an int, and it is auto incremented. So every time you create a new vendor account, this auto increments by 1. We have a vendor name that is text, and we have a vendor address that is text. Now, obviously, again, with these tables can be much larger. I just made small tables here just to make it easier to understand what's going on. From that, we can do a select statement to see what's in these two different tables. So if we do select, so all the information from all the columns, select all from, and we're going to do the parts table, semicolon. Okay, so we have a part ID. So we have a cog with a part ID of 1, with a part price of 11.5, with a vendor ID of 1. We have a rod, part ID of 2, part price of $2.50, vendor ID of 2. We have a sprocket, $5, vendor ID of 3, nut, $8.50, vendor ID of 1, so on and so forth. And then we can do a select all from vendors, semicolon. And then here what we can see is we have vendor ID of 1, 2, or 3. So again, this corresponds to this, right? This corresponds to this, and this corresponds to this. Then for those vendors, we have Sue's Sprockets out of California. We have the Mega Cog Corp out of Texas, and we have Widgets Are Us, and they are out of Oregon, right? So this is how you can have two separate tables. So you have one table, and all this one table does is it focuses on the parts. So you only put the information about the parts in there, and then the vendors, this is one table only for the vendors. And so basically how you're able to connect the two tables is if you want to say, okay, the cog is being sold to us by, Sue's Sprockets. Instead of having to put all of the information for Sue's Sprockets into this parts table, you can simply reference it with the vendor ID, and then you'll be able to connect using this thing called the inner join. So from here, what we're going to do, again, we're going to do Control L to clear the screen, and now we are going to do the inner join. So we're going to do select. Let's just select all. So we're going to select all columns, right? And then we're going to say from parts, and then we're going to say inner join. So we're using the inner join here. So we're going to select all from the parts. So the first table that we're going to be dealing with, and then we're going to say inner join. So join this with another table. So we're going to say inner join on, inner join vendors. So we're joining parts with vendors. And then we're going to say on, and then here's where we get to the naming convention. So we do parts dot vendor underscore ID. So the parts table, the vendor ID field. So we're joining that. We're going to say that equals the vendors table dot vendor underscore ID field. And then we're going to hit semicolon. And hopefully, if I didn't fat finger this will work. Okay, so now we are actually getting both tables are actually now joined together. Let me adjust the font size here. So we're going to go here. We're going to shrink this down to 15 to make this a little easier to see. And see now, so basically see before where we had two tables and there were two entirely different tables. Now by using that inner join, we're actually able to connect those two tables together, and we're able to interact with those two tables as if they are one single table. So, COG, part price of $11.50. Again, we got this vendor ID, so this is what joins the two together. So we know the COG's vendor's name is Sue Sprockets, and the vendor's address is California. The sprocket for $5 is joined based off of that vendor ID. That's provided by Widgets R Us out of Oregon. Again, the washer is $6.25, joined off the vendor ID. That is being provided by the Mega Cog out of Texas, right? And so that's how you're able to combine those two together. And so one of the things that you can do then is you can do like different statements. So instead of doing a select all, possibly now we could do, let's say, select, let's say part, let's say, oops. Oh, so we're going to say select part underscore name from parts inner join vendors on parts dot vendor underscore ID equals vendors dot vendor underscore ID. And then we're going to use where vendor underscore name equals, and let's say Mega Cog. So let's see what parts are being provided to us from the Mega Cog company. Then we do the semicolon, and we're going to hit enter. And so what we're going to see here is that the rod and the washer, those are provided by the Mega Cog company. So we can go up here, again, where it was joined before. So we can see rod is provided by Mega Cog, and the washer is provided by Mega Cog. And so what that inner join allows you to do is it allows you to connect those two tables based off of the parameter, again, the vendor ID, so that you can then interact with those two tables as if they're one single table. So that gives you an idea of what joins are. Again, what I showed you today was an inner join. There are left joins, there are right joins. So there are different types of joins out there that will obviously give you different results. But I wanted to show you the inner join today because I think that is the simplest one to get your head around. So essentially what you're going to have is you're going to have two different tables. But within those two different tables, there will be columns that then can correspond to each other. So again, in the parts table, when it comes to the vendors, we just simply have a vendor ID. So we don't have to put all the full vendor information. We can simply put the ID number for the vendor. That corresponds to the vendors table that has a vendor ID. And then essentially we're able to join based off of that vendor ID. Now again, the warning here is for that inner join, both fields have to be populated for the join to work. So the part has to have a vendor ID number, and obviously the vendor ID has to have a vendor ID number. number for this join to actually be able to connect these two tables. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, and that's why you would use a left join or a right join. Again, we will talk about those later. But with this, you're going to have one column that corresponds to another column. You do the join on that. Combines the two, and then you're able to run SQL statements off of that joined, those two joined tables, as if they are one single solid table. So this is very easy, especially for things like doing reports. So if you want to pull out information, be able to print things out, you can do this because you can then join those two tables together. And that's really all there is to a basic inner join, and it's one of the things that can make MySQL very powerful. Again, when you start looking at technologies, especially things like databases and all that kind of thing, it's these simple little tools that actually provide the most functionality and really make the technology or the product that you're dealing with very valuable, right? So you have all of these different tables. So you have all these different tables, and the question is then how do you connect them to actually make something useful for you? And one of the ways that you're able to do that is that by joining those tables together when you're doing SQL statements, you can connect the two tables, and that way you can have dedicated information dedicated for one type of thing. Again, vendors, parts, users, that type of thing in one table. You can have another table dedicated to some other different type of information, and then when you want to connect the two, you're able to use the join. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Again, it's one of those things, go experiment, play with it, figure things out, and I think the more you work with it, the more it'll make sense to you. So as always, I enjoyed teaching this class, and look forward to seeing you at the next one. Apparently, the type of content you just saw is not what Susan W. wants for the future of YouTube. This means that recommendations by YouTube to this channel have dropped massively and views are becoming comically small. I hate to ask. I used to say I would never ask, but if you could subscribe, like, comment, and most importantly, share the videos that you appreciate, that may help slow the death of this channel. Do remember that if anything at all happens to this channel, you can go to EliTheComputerGuy.com to view the content and access information not available on YouTube.